3:30 in the morning. Two B-2 Spirit stealth bombers were already 300 miles inside Iranian airspace, their bat-wing silhouettes invisible to the radar net, screaming fruitlessly below. This was not a routine freedom of navigation flight, or a mere show of force. The internal payload bays were primed, and the targeting computers were locked onto a strategic target that had been a red line for the United States for over a decade. The question remaining for the four pilots was not whether the mission would succeed, but if the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Armored Brigade at Kermanshah would even realize they were under fire before the first shockwave vaporized their command center. The air at 40,000 feet was a frozen void of -50 degrees, thin and silent. Below the aircraft, the Zagros Mountains appeared as jagged obsidian teeth under a moonless sky, while inside the pressurized cockpits, the only scent was the sterile, metallic tang of recycled oxygen and the faint heat of humming electronics. The lead aircraft, call sign Reaper 11, maintained a steady course on a flight path calculated to the centimeter. Inside the cockpit, the mission commander adjusted the brightness of his multi-function displays. There was no chatter. The United States Air Force had spent thousands of hours simulating this exact flight profile. Every turn was designed to exploit the gaps in the Iranian early warning system, weaving between the overlapping coverage of older radar sites and the newer, more dangerous HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries. The professionalism of the crew was absolute. They moved with the practiced, quiet efficiency of surgeons. In the belly of each B-2 Spirit sat 30 GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions. These were 2,000-pound precision bombs, each fitted with a satellite guidance kit that turned a dumb gravity bomb into a surgical instrument of destruction. Combined, the two bombers carried 60 of these weapons. Their target was a massive complex on the outskirts of Kermanshah, a base that housed the core of an Iranian Revolutionary Guard armored brigade. Intelligence reports had confirmed that over 120 T-90S tanks and 75 armored personnel carriers were concentrated in the motor pools, fueled and ready for a move toward the border. The pilots of Reaper 11 watched the countdown timer on the glass display. 5 minutes to the release point. The mission commander felt the slight vibration of the aircraft as the flight control surfaces made minute adjustments to compensate for high-altitude winds. For the crew, the enemy was not a collection of men, but a series of coordinates and heat signatures displayed on a high-resolution screen. They were the tip of a massive spear, supported by a network of satellites and electronic warfare assets that spanned the globe. 300 miles to the south, a carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf was monitoring the mission in total silence. The United States Navy had cleared a path by jamming long-range communication frequencies, ensuring that even if a local observer saw the bombers, the report would never reach the Central Command in Tehran. Everything was proceeding according to the systematic, disciplined plan of a United States military campaign. The target area finally began to resolve on the synthetic aperture radar. The Kermanshah base was a sprawling grid of reinforced concrete hangars, fuel depots, and barracks. Even from 7 miles up, the infrared sensors could pick out the heat blooms from the tank engines that had been idling just an hour before. The Iranian brigade was preparing for a dawn departure. They were an elite unit, the pride of their regional command. Yet they were completely exposed to an enemy they could not see. Targeting solution confirmed, the mission commander said, his voice calm and flat. 60-second window. All systems green. The co-pilot nodded, his hands resting lightly on the controls. The B-2 Spirit was now a platform for physics. The bombs were slaved to the aircraft's inertial navigation system, waiting for the electronic command to drop into the dark. The tension in the cockpit was not born of fear, but of the intense focus required to execute a strike of this magnitude. Every second was a choreographed movement in a dance of high-technology warfare. The Zagros Mountains fell away behind them as they leveled out for the final run. The air remained still, the silence of the high atmosphere masking the violence that was seconds away from being unleashed. The mission commander reached for the master arm switch. The 60 precision bombs were now live, their internal batteries activated, their guidance fins unlocked. The fate of the armored brigade was no longer a matter of strategy. It was now a matter of gravity and terminal velocity. 3:35 in the morning. The National Security Council chamber in Washington and the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar. While the two B-2 Spirit bombers glided through the Iranian night, the intelligence infrastructure of the United States was focused on a single grid square. At coordinates 34 degrees 18 minutes north, 47 degrees 1 minute east. This was the Kermanshah military complex, the home of the 81st Armored Brigade of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. For 72 hours, the National Reconnaissance Office had been downloading high-resolution synthetic aperture radar imagery every 45 minutes, watching as a localized exercise transformed into a full-scale mobilization. The 81st Armored Brigade was not a typical infantry unit. It was a heavy strike formation, equipped with 120 T-90S main battle tanks, which were the most advanced armored platforms in the Iranian inventory. Supporting these tanks were 85 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, and a full battalion of self-propelled artillery consisting of 24 155mm howitzers. Intelligence analysts had identified a specific pattern of behavior. The brigade had moved from its hardened shelters into open assembly areas. Fuel trucks were tethered to the tank columns, and ammunition crates were being loaded into the transport vehicles. The move toward the Iraqi border, specifically toward the Diyala province, was estimated to begin in less than 3 hours. The decision to strike was rooted in a strategic red line established 6 months prior. United States intelligence had confirmed that the 81st Brigade was being used as a delivery system for a new generation of short-range ballistic missiles that could be launched from the back of modified heavy trucks. If these mobile launchers reached the border, they could threaten every United States facility and allied port in the region with less than 5 minutes of warning. The mission of the strike package was to decapitate this capability before the first engine turned over for the march west. The Kermanshah Valley itself provided a natural defensive bowl. The surrounding Zagros Mountains rose to an altitude of nearly 10,000 feet, creating a complex radar environment that the Iranian military believed would shield them from high-altitude observation. They had placed 4 HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries on the surrounding ridges, their long-range radars scanning the horizon for conventional strike packages. But the B-2 Spirit was designed for this exact environment. Its smooth, continuous curves and radar-absorbent skin were engineered to reflect electronic pulses away from the source, making the massive aircraft appear no larger than a small bird. On the Iranian screens, inside the lead bomber, the mission commander reviewed the target priority list. The first 30 GBU-31 precision-guided munitions were assigned to the motor pools. The logic was systematic and cold. By destroying the fuel reserves and the lead vehicles in the column, the United States Air Force would turn the base into a massive, burning traffic jam. The remaining 30 bombs were slaved to the command and control bunkers and the reinforced ammunition storage facilities. The goal was total neutralization of the 81st Brigade as a fighting force in a single pass. The air inside the bomber remained pressurized and still, a sharp contrast to the frantic activity occurring on the ground 5 miles below. In the motor pools of Kermanshah, hundreds of Iranian soldiers were moving through the dark, the smell of diesel exhaust, and the clatter of steel tracks filling the night air. They were unaware that 6,000 miles away, at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, a team of analysts was watching them in real time through the thermal lens of a multi-billion-dollar satellite network. The tactical data link on the B-2 flickered with an update. The target coordinates had been refined by another 3 meters. Based on the latest imagery, we have a confirmed lock on the primary fuel farm, the co-pilot reported. His voice was steady, filtered through the high-grade communications mask. Wind correction entered. The guidance kits are receiving the GPS handshake. The complexity of the mission required absolute synchronization. Every one of the 60 bombs had to impact within a 40-second window to ensure the defender had no time to scatter their assets or activate secondary defenses. The United States military relied on this level of precision, a marriage of orbital intelligence, stealth technology, and disciplined airmanship. This was not a war of attrition. It was a clinical removal of a strategic threat. As the stealth bomber aircraft reached the final ADADed, 20 miles of its approach, the Zagros Mountains began to glow in the infrared sensors. The heat from the idling heavy tanks was so intense, it looked like a bed of white-hot coals on the cockpit displays. The mission commander placed his gloved hand on the release trigger. The cold, thin air outside the aircraft screamed past the composite hull at 500 miles per hour, but inside the bay, the 60 bombs hung in the dark, waiting for the command to fall. 3:37 in the morning, 120 miles to the west, over the border in Iraq, 3 EA-18 Golf Growlers from a United States Navy electronic attack squadron maintained a circular orbit at 30,000 feet. While the B-2 Spirit bombers were the hammer, these aircraft were the velvet glove that blinded the victim. The mission of the Growlers was to saturate the electromagnetic spectrum, ensuring that even if the Iranian HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries detected a flicker of a stealth profile, they would be unable to achieve a fire control lock. Inside the cockpit of the lead Growler, the electronic warfare officer watched a waterfall of green data on his screen, identifying the specific frequencies of the Iranian Big Bird and Cheeseboard radars located on the ridges surrounding Kermanshah. The air inside the cockpit was cold, smelling of the dry, ionized scent of high-powered cooling systems working at maximum capacity to prevent the jamming pods from overheating. The electronic warfare officer, known by the call sign Stitch, adjusted the power output of the AN/ALQ-99 jamming pods, hanging from the wings. The United States military did not just block signals, they manipulated them. They were currently projecting digital noise that made the Iranian radar screens appear as though they were malfunctioning or experiencing heavy atmospheric interference. To the Iranian operators, in the bunkers below, the night sky looked empty, even as two of the most expensive aircraft in history moved directly into their kill zones. The professionalism of the electronic attack teams was the foundation upon which the entire strike rested. Without this silent shield, the B-2 Spirits would be vulnerable to the sheer volume of interceptors and missiles the Iranian Revolutionary Guard could launch. "I have a spike on the HQ-9 battery at Kermanshah North," Stitch reported over the secure tactical data link. "They are increasing power on their acquisition radar. It looks like they are trying to burn through our jamming." The pilot of the lead Growler banked the aircraft slightly, keeping the jamming pods oriented toward the target. "Copy that. Ready the AGM-88 HARM missiles. If they transition to a tracking frequency, we take the site out." The AGM-88 high-speed problems anti-radiation missile was a weapon designed to follow a radar signal back to its source like a shark following a trail of blood. The United States Air Force and Navy worked in perfect synchronization, a hallmark of the Joint Force Doctrine that defined modern American military power. The Growlers carried 4 of these missiles each, their seeker heads already programmed with the electronic fingerprints of the Iranian Air Defense Network. The environment of the electronic battlefield was one of pure mathematics and invisible energy, where a shift of 10 megahertz could mean the difference between life and death for the strike package. Down on the ridges of the Zagros Mountains, the Iranian radar technicians were growing frustrated. Their screens were filled with flickering patterns of white static that refused to clear. They checked their cables, their power supplies, and their cooling units, unaware that the interference was being beamed from 3 aircraft circling over another country. The discipline of the American crews was reflected in their restraint. They did not fire their missiles yet, choosing instead to stay in the shadows of the spectrum, keeping the enemy guessing. The Growlers also monitored the Iranian tactical radio nets, using advanced linguistics, software, and signal processing. The United States intelligence officers on board could hear the confusion growing in the Iranian command centers. The reports coming from the 81st Armored Brigade were confident, focused on the upcoming mobilization, while the air defense units were beginning to report technical anomalies. This disconnect was intentional, a result of the systematic degradation of the enemy's situational awareness. The air over the border was thin and freezing, but the electronic space was white-hot with the energy of the jamming pods. Reaper 1-1. This is Stitch, the electronic warfare officer transmitted. The corridor is clear. The HQ-9 batteries are suppressed. You are cleared for the terminal run. The response from the B-2 bomber was a single click of the radio, a silent acknowledgement of the professional bond between the two services. The United States Navy had done its job, providing the invisibility the Air Force needed to complete the mission. The Growlers continued their orbit, their engines a steady hum in the Iraqi night, their sensors reaching out across the mountains to hold the Iranian defenses in a digital stranglehold. The precision of the timing was absolute, measured in milliseconds, ensuring that the shield remained in place until the very moment the first bomb hit the Earth. 3:40 in the morning. The terminal approach. The two B-2 Spirit bombers leveled out at 38,000 feet, their internal GPS systems slave to a constellation of 24 satellites orbiting high above the Earth. Inside the cockpit of Reaper 1-1, the mission commander could see the Kermanshah Valley spread out on his high-resolution thermal display. It looked like a glowing map of veins and arteries, with the heat from the 81st Armored Brigade's idling engines pulsing in the dark. The air at this altitude was a brittle, freezing vacuum, but inside the composite skin of the aircraft, the hum of the cooling fans and the rhythmic clicking of the flight computers created a cocoon of lethal precision. The environment of the Zagros Mountains, usually a jagged barrier of wind and rock, was now merely a backdrop for the American strike. The scent in the cockpit was a dry, recycled mix of ozone and the faint burnt smell of high-voltage electronics. The mission commander's gloved fingers hovered over the release sequence, his eyes scanning the time-to-go indicator. 60 seconds. The B-2 was no longer just an aircraft. It was a $21 billion delivery system for 60 individual verdicts. Every detail of the approach was dictated by the United States Air Force's stealth and precision doctrine. The bombers did not fly in a straight line, but followed a jagged dogleg path designed to keep their most radar-absorbent edges pointed toward the highest threat Iranian sensors. The discipline of the two-man crew was absolute. They did not speak, they did not fidget. They were an extension of the machine, focused entirely on the digital crosshairs that were now centered on the primary fuel farm and the command bunkers of the Revolutionary Guard. 5 miles below, the scene was one of frantic terrestrial energy. The 81st Armored Brigade was a hive of activity. Thousands of Iranian soldiers, their breath visible in the cold mountain air, were performing final checks on their T-90S tanks. The smell of thick diesel smoke and the sharp chemical bite of hydraulic fluid filled the motor pools. Officers shouted orders over the roar of engines, completely unaware that the very heat they were generating to warm their tanks was acting as a beacon for the satellites and the bombers loitering in the blackness above. The co-pilot of Reaper 1-1 checked the status of the 60 GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions. Each bomb's internal battery was fully charged, and the guidance fins were performing their final bit built-in test cycle. The precision required for this mission was not just about hitting the target, but hitting the target at the exact millisecond necessary to overwhelm the defender's ability to react. The United States military's superiority rested on this: the ability to synchronize thousands of moving parts across half the globe into a single, cohesive moment of impact. 30 seconds to release, the co-pilot whispered, more to himself than his commander. The Zagros Mountains seemed to lean in, the shadows of the peaks stretching across the valley floor. The B-2 Spirit began its final steady-state run. The weapon bay doors, two massive serrated panels on the underside of the fuselage, began their slow, hydraulic cycle. They opened into the slipstream with a low, thrumming vibration that moved through the floorboards of the cockpit. For those few seconds, the aircraft's stealth profile was compromised as the cavernous interior was exposed to the sky. But it didn't matter. The Iranian radar operators were still staring at screens filled with the digital ghosts and white noise provided by the Growlers circling to the west. The mission commander watched the countdown reach 5, 4, 3. The air outside the bombers was silent, but the kinetic energy stored in the 62,000-pound bombs was immense. They were not just pieces of steel and high explosives, they were the physical manifestation of American strategic policy. The release command was sent. Inside the bays, the pneumatic ejector racks fired with a series of sharp, mechanical clacks that echoed through the airframe. One by one, 30 bombs from each aircraft tumbled into the freezing void, their nose-mounted seeker heads immediately searching for the GPS signal. The bombers lurched upward, suddenly lightened by 60 tons of ordnance. The weapon bay doors snapped shut, returning the Spirit to its invisible state. The bombs were now on their own. 60 streaks of dark metal screaming toward the valley at the speed of sound. 3:41 in the morning. The terminal descent. The trigger was squeezed, and the 60 GBU-31 precision bombs shrieked off their pneumatic racks, 60 columns of dark steel punching through the freezing air as they began their 3-minute fall from 38,000 feet. Each bomb's internal guidance fins snapped open with a sharp, mechanical crack, catching the thin atmosphere and carving a path toward the glowing heat signatures of the 81st Armored Brigade. The descent was silent and invisible, 60 individual verdicts falling at 900 kilometers per hour, guided by a satellite handshake that was accurate to within 3 meters. Below them, the Kermanshah Valley was a bowl of unsuspecting energy. The T-90S tanks still idling in their neat, geometric rows, their crews laughing and smoking in the cold air, completely unaware that the sky above them was filled with 60 tons of high explosives. The first bomb impacted the primary fuel farm at the northern edge of the motor pool. The 2,000-pound warhead punched clean through the reinforced steel of the main storage tank, penetrating 4 meters of liquid fuel before the delayed action fuse detonated. A fireball 300 meters wide erupted instantly, a geyser of white-hot chemical flame that bleached the midnight sky into the color of a noon sun. The heat blast, reaching temperatures of 3,000 degrees, washed across the nearest row of tanks, melting rubber track pads and shattering every piece of glass in a half-mile radius. The sound was not a bang, but a terrestrial roar that cracked eardrums and threw men off their feet 2 kilometers away. 3 seconds later, the second wave of 30 bombs drove into the heart of the armored columns. One warhead slammed directly onto the engine deck of a lead T-90S tank. The kinetic energy alone buckled the chassis before the explosive charge detonated, sympathetic firing the 60 rounds of high explosive ammunition stored in the tank's internal carousel. The turret, a 12-ton mass of composite armor, was blasted off the hull, rising 6 meters into the air on a pillar of fire before it fell back and crushed a BMP-3 infantry vehicle parked alongside it. Black, oily smoke boiled out of the ruptured hulls, and the smell of burning diesel and vaporized metal filled the valley in a choking cloud. The defenders' reaction was one of pure, unadulterated chaos. The Iranian soldiers who survived the initial blast wave did not run for their weapons. They ran from the heat. Men staggered through the fire, their shadows stretched long and distorted by the flickering orange light. In the command bunker, the officers watched their monitors go black as the third wave of bombs severed the underground fiber optic cables and crushed the reinforced concrete roof of the communication center. The brigade's structure did not just bend, it shattered. The radio channels, previously filled with disciplined orders, erupted into a cacophony of overlapping screams and desperate status reports that no one was left to hear. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of hell. 60 distinct craters now pockmarked the Kermanshah base, each one a smoldering ruin of twisted girders and burning rubber. The 60 precision bombs had achieved exactly what the United States Air Force had planned: the systematic removal of the brigade's mobility and its brain. The white light of the explosions began to fade into a deep, angry red as the secondary fires took hold, the ammunition cooking off in the wrecks with a series of sharp, rhythmic pops. The silence of the Zagros Mountains had been replaced by the roar of a man-made volcano, and the 81st Armored Brigade had ceased to exist as a functional military unit before the first Iranian radar operator could even report a contact. 3:45 in the morning. The inferno at Kermanshah. The secondary explosions began in a rhythmic, terrifying sequence. as the fire from the primary fuel farm reached the mobile ammunition trucks of the 81st Armored Brigade. This was the cook-off phase, where the heat from the initial 60 precision strikes became a weapon of its own, reaching temperatures that ignited the 125mm high-explosive tank rounds inside their armored carousels. Each T-90S tank that had survived the direct impact of the GBU-31 bombs now became a localized volcano, the internal pressure building until the turrets were blown 10 meters into the air on pillars of white-hot propellant gas. The air in the valley, once cold and crisp, was now a thick, oily soup of vaporized diesel, burnt rubber, and the metallic tang of shredded composite armor. The United States Air Force had calculated the probability of kill for this mission at 94%, but the reality on the ground was a total systematic collapse. The 95 BMP, 3 infantry fighting vehicles, parked in tight rows to facilitate the dawn march, were being consumed by a chain reaction of fire. As one vehicle's fuel tank ruptured, it sprayed burning accelerant onto the next, creating a river of fire that flowed through the motor pools. The Iranian soldiers who had survived the first minute were now trapped in a landscape where the ground itself seemed to be screaming. The sound of melting aluminum and the constant, sharp cracks of small arms ammunition cooking off created a wall of noise that drowned out any attempt at organized command. In the hardened command bunker, the situation was even more dire. While the bunker's thick concrete walls had technically survived the shockwaves, the 60 precision bombs had been programmed with delay fuses that allowed them to penetrate deep into the earth before detonating. The vibrations from these subterranean explosions had shattered the cooling pipes for the brigade's main servers and severed the backup power lines. The lights flickered and died, leaving the senior Iranian officers in a tomb of red emergency glow and choking dust. They were effectively blind, their radio masts on the surface having been twisted into scrap metal by the initial blast wave. The professionalism of the United States strike was evident in the lack of collateral waste. Every one of the 60 bombs had found its designated coordinate, leaving the civilian outskirts of Kermanshah untouched while the military heart of the region was turned into a blackened crater. The Zagros Mountains acted as a natural acoustic chamber, reflecting the roar of the secondary explosions back into the valley, a constant reminder to the surviving Iranian forces that their elite heavy strike formation had been neutralized in under 400 seconds. Above the chaos, the 2 B-2 Spirit bombers were already turning south, their mission complete. Their sensors recorded the massive infrared blooms from the secondary explosions, data that was being streamed in real time back to the Pentagon. To the pilots of Reaper 11, the mission was a series of successful checklists and green lights. To the 81st Armored Brigade, it was the end of their history. The silence of the high atmosphere was a stark contrast to the graveyard of burning steel they left behind, a testament to the devastating efficiency of a United States military campaign conducted with absolute precision. 3:50 in the morning. The chaos at Kermanshah expanded as the surviving elements of the 81st Armored Brigade attempted a desperate, disorganized response. The air above the valley was no longer transparent. It was a swirling vortex of black soot, white chemical smoke from the fire suppressors, and the shimmering distortion of intense heat. At the edge of the base, 2 HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries that had escaped the initial blast finally achieved a partial power-up, their radar dishes spinning frantically as they searched the sky for the ghosts that had just crippled their brigade. But there was nothing to see. The B-2 Spirit bombers were already 60 miles away, their radar cross-sections swallowed by the vast, empty darkness of the high atmosphere. The Iranian response was hampered by a total collapse of the chain of command. With the primary and backup communication hubs vaporized, the surviving platoon leaders were left to make independent decisions in a vacuum of information. One company of T-90S tanks, positioned on the far western perimeter, attempted to start their engines and disperse into the surrounding hills. The sound of 1,200 horsepower diesel engines roaring to life added to the cacophony, but the movement was sluggish. The crews, coughing from the acrid smoke of the burning fuel farm, struggled to navigate through a landscape where the familiar landmarks of their base had been replaced by smoldering, craters, and twisted heaps of steel. On the ridges of the Zagros Mountains, the air defense crews were screaming into their radios, demanding coordinates for a target that did not exist on their screens. The United States Navy Growlers, still orbiting in Iraqi airspace, watched this electronic panic with clinical detachment. Every time an Iranian radar technician increased the gain on his equipment, the Growlers responded with a targeted burst of digital noise, making the radar displays bloom with false contacts and ghost targets. To the defenders, it appeared as though 100 aircraft were attacking from every direction at once. The psychological toll of being hit by an invisible enemy was becoming as destructive as the bombs themselves. A single Iranian interceptor and 4 Phantom, launched from a secondary strip 60 miles to the north, streaked into the Kermanshah airspace at 1,000 kilometers per hour. The pilot's eyes were wide as he looked down at the valley. From his cockpit, the base looked like a glowing red wound on the surface of the Earth. He banked hard, searching for a thermal signature with his aging radar, but he was hunting a shadow. He flew through a cloud of debris and smoke so thick it nearly stalled his engines, but he found nothing to lock onto. The professionalism of the American strike package had left him with no one to fight. Below, on the ground, the medical teams were finally beginning to move, but they were overwhelmed. The heat from the 60 precision bombs had been so intense that the asphalt of the motor pools had turned into a sticky, black liquid, trapping vehicles and men alike. The smell of ozone and burnt insulation from the destroyed electronics mingled with the stench of charred uniforms. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard, usually a symbol of iron discipline, was reduced to individuals wandering through the fire, their faces bleached white by shock. The strategic reality was settling in. The 81st Armored Brigade, a unit that was supposed to be the spearhead of a regional offensive, was now a logistical nightmare. Even the tanks that hadn't been hit were pinned down by the wreckage of the fuel trucks and the craters that had severed the only exit roads. The United States military had achieved more than just physical destruction. They had paralyzed the defenders' ability to think, react, or even retreat. The Kermanshah strike was a masterclass in the application of overwhelming, invisible force. 4:15 in the morning, high above the Persian Gulf, the United States Air Force Global Strike Command was already receiving the first batch of post-strike data. A RQ-4 Global Hawk drone, orbiting at 60,000 feet just outside Iranian territorial waters, used its long-range synthetic aperture radar to peer through the thick palls of smoke still rising from the Kermanshah Valley. This was the battle damage assessment phase, a cold, mathematical tally of the 60 precision bombs' effectiveness. The data was cross-referenced with pre-strike thermal imagery and satellite signals intelligence to confirm that the objective, the total neutralization of the 81st Armored Brigade, had been achieved with systematic efficiency. The report was staggering. Of the 120 T-90S main battle tanks assigned to the brigade, 84 were confirmed as total losses, their turrets blown off or holes melted by the intense heat of the secondary fuel fires. Another 22 vehicles were classified as mobility kills, pinned in place by deep craters or crushed by falling debris from the destroyed hangars. The brigade's entire inventory of BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles had been caught in the river of fire created by the ruptured fuel farm. 82 out of 95 vehicles were now nothing more than blackened aluminum skeletons. The human cost for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was equally severe, though the United States military focused on the hardware. Intelligence analysts estimated that over 400 personnel had been killed in the initial 30 seconds of the strike, with another 600 wounded. The command structure of the brigade was effectively dead. The 60-bomb strike had achieved a decapitation of the unit's leadership, leaving the survivors without orders, without communications, and without a clear path of retreat. The 81st Brigade had been erased from the Iranian order of battle in less than 10 minutes. The 60 precision-guided munitions had performed with a reliability rate of 98%. Only one bomb had failed to detonate upon impact, and it had landed in a secondary motor pool where the kinetic force of the 2,000-pound, steel casing had still been enough to crush 2 transport trucks. The circular error probable. The measure of the bomb's accuracy was recorded at less than 2 meters. This level of precision allowed the United States to claim a strategic victory without the massive collateral damage that would have characterized a traditional carpet bombing campaign. In the defense headquarters facility, the mood was one of quiet, professional satisfaction. The strike had sent a clear message to the regional command. The red line regarding ballistic missile mobilization was absolute. The Kermanshah Valley, once the pride of the Iranian Armored Corps, was now a 60-acre graveyard of burning Russian-made steel and scorched earth. The smell of the smoke reached miles into the surrounding countryside, a physical reminder of the reach and power of the United States Air Force. As the Global Hawk drone continued its orbit, the thermal signatures on the ground began to cool, shifting from a bright, angry white to a dull, smoldering red. The Iranian emergency services were finally arriving at the perimeter of the base, but they were forced to wait. The constant pop of cooking off tank ammunition made it suicide to enter the motor pools. The 81st Armored Brigade was not just destroyed, it was still a live, dangerous wreck that continued to consume itself. The mission was a total success. 4:30 in the morning, 400 miles southwest of Kermanshah. The 2 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, Reaper 1-1 and Reaper 1-2, were now crossing back into the relative safety of the international air corridors over the Persian Gulf. The adrenaline of the weapon release window had been replaced by the disciplined, grinding focus of the long-range egress. For the 4 pilots, the mission was far from over. They were operating on 22 hours of continuous flight time, their bodies fueled by high-protein rations and the steady, cool flow of filtered oxygen. The cockpit of the lead bomber remained, a temple of quiet professionalism, the only sounds being the low-frequency thrum of the 4 General Electric Phone 118 non-afterburning engines, and the occasional soft chime of the defensive management system. The threat environment was still active, though the immediate danger of the Kermanshah air defense net was now 100 miles behind them. To the north, the Iranian Air Force had scrambled a pair of 14 Tomcat interceptors from the base at Isfahan. On the mission commander's tactical display, these appeared as 2 tiny, yellow triangles moving at Mach 1.2, their powerful AN/AWG-9 radars sweeping the sky in a desperate attempt to find the intruders. The air at 40,000 feet was a dark, thin expanse of -55 degrees, and the B-2 Spirits moved through it like ghosts. The pilots didn't change course. They trusted in the $3 billion of radar-absorbent material and the curved, seamless geometry of their aircraft to keep them invisible to the aging Iranian sensors. "Stitch has the Tomcats," the co-pilot whispered, glancing at the data link from the Navy Growlers still loitering near the border. "Copy. Maintain MCON Delta," the mission commander replied, his voice raspy from hours of breathing dry air. EMCON Delta meant total electronic silence. The bombers were not transmitting a single pulse of energy that could be traced back to them. They were relying entirely on passive sensors, infrared cameras, and long-range optical trackers to maintain situational awareness. To the Iranian pilots high above the Zagros Mountains, the sky was a black void. They were hunting for a shadow with a flashlight, unaware that the B-2 Spirits were already sliding past them, their black-painted bellies blending perfectly with the starless night below. The environment of the egress was one of calculated patience. Every minute of flight was a balance of fuel management and stealth. The bombers had to stay within a narrow altitude airspeed window to ensure their engine exhaust remained cool enough to defeat any heat-seeking missiles launched from the ground. The scent in the cockpit had changed, now smelling of the sharp, chemical bite of the anti-ice systems and the faint, sweet odor of hydraulic fluid under pressure. The deck beneath the pilot's feet vibrated with a rhythmic, high-frequency hum that signaled the aircraft was performing exactly as engineered. 6,000 miles away, at Global Strike Command, the mission controllers were watching the fuel states of the 2 bombers with clinical intensity. The B-2 Spirit is a thirsty machine, and the 60-bomb payload had taxed its reserves. A KC-46 Pegasus tanker was already orbiting, over the Arabian Sea, waiting to provide the gas and go that would allow the bombers to complete the final 10-hour leg of their journey back to the United States. The professionalism of the American refueling crews was the final, critical link in the chain of this global operation. As the first hint of a deep purple dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, the two bombers crossed the coastline. Behind them, the 81st Armored Brigade was still a pillar of black smoke visible from space, but for the crews of Reaper 11 and 12, the war was now a matter of flight geometry and navigation waypoints. They had executed one of the most complex strikes in the history of the United States Air Force, and they had done it without being seen, heard, or touched. The silence of the cockpit was the silence of a mission accomplished. 5:15 in the morning. The final report. The two B-2 Spirit bombers had cleared the last layer of Iranian-monitored airspace, and the mission was now transitioning from a tactical strike to a strategic reality for the United States. In the pressurized, quiet cockpits of Reaper 11 and 12, the pilots began the slow, methodical process of post-strike logging. The smell of the cabin was now heavy with the scent of coffee from the onboard warming units, and the dry, metallic odor of the life support systems. The Zagros Mountains were a dark, jagged memory behind them, replaced by the vast, shimmering gray of the Arabian Sea. The strategic aftermath of the destruction of the 81st Armored Brigade at Kermanshah was already rippling through the world's intelligence centers. By destroying 60% of the unit's heavy armor and 100% of its mobile fuel and ammunition infrastructure, the United States had effectively paralyzed the northern axis of the planned Iranian mobilization. The 60 precision-guided munitions had achieved a force multiplication effect. It would take the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps months, if not years, to replace the T-90S tanks and the specialized technical personnel lost in the 10-minute engagement. In Washington, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff received the final battle damage assessment. The mission was classified as a complete operational success. The professionalism of the United States Air Force and Navy had been demonstrated with clinical precision: 60 bombs, 60 targets, and 0 American casualties. The hook-first doctrine of the global strike mission had worked. The enemy was defeated before they even realized the engagement had begun. The silence of the Kermanshah Valley, now filled only with the hiss of cooling metal and the drift of black smoke, was a testament to the reach of American power. The B-2 Spirits eventually banked toward the east, beginning their final 10-hour journey across the Pacific toward Whiteman Air Force Base. The mission commander of Reaper 11 looked out the small, thick window of the cockpit as the first rays of the sun hit the composite wing. The aircraft, a multi-billion-dollar ghost of carbon and logic, caught the light for just a second before the pilot adjusted the trim, and it vanished back into the glare of the morning. The operation was over. The 81st Armored Brigade was a memory, and the strategic red line had been held. The professionalism of the crews, the invisibility of the technology, and the systematic application of force had converged into a single, devastating moment. As the bombers droned toward the horizon, the digital records of the strike were archived, the coordinates were cleared, and the silent, cold air of the high atmosphere closed in behind them, leaving no trace of the ghosts that had just changed the map of the Middle East.